Hello, welcome to the Innsmouth Wrap-Up here at the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast. Today we've got my pal Chris Lackey interviewing Robert M. Price about the sociological and literary origins of the Shadow over Innsmouth. Robert is, of course, a professor of theology and scriptural studies at the Coleman Theological Seminary, and an author of many great books on religion and myth, as well as Lovecraft. He's the host of his own show, The Bible Geek, and one of the hosts of Point of Inquiry, links to which you can find in our show notes. After that, Chris and I get on the horn with one of our favorite guys, Donovan K. Loucks. Donovan is the creator and keeper of this show's main resource, HPPodcraft.com, where you can find the most accurate versions of Lovecraft's work, as well as criticism and all sorts of great information. Donovan is also an expert on Lovecraftian architecture and geography. He's got some fascinating insights to share about Innsmouth and more, including facts about the case of Charles Dexter Ward, never heard publicly until the end of this program. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get going here at
HPPodcraft.com.
Has produced this record.
Chris Lackey here, and I've got Lovecraftian scholar and guru Robert M. Price on the phone with me. Glad to have you back on the show, Bob.
Good to be here.
Before we get into talking about Innsmouth, I was wondering if you had any interesting projects going on right now.
Well, last week I sat down and wrote about 5 stories I owed to different editors and the like. I just finished a Thongor story using Lynn Carter's character. It's called Vampires of Lemuria, and you can tell it's real high-class literature. A couple of other horror stories of different kinds. And one I collaborated with the 8-year-old son of a friend of mine on one called I Am Legion, A Tale of the Frankenstein Monster.
What?
And I've really been enjoying that.
Wow, sounds cool. On the show, we've been talking about the Shadow over Innsmouth. And in my readings, I noticed that Ken Hite, in his book Tour to Lovecraft, said that you had one of the best structural analysis of this story in your introduction to the Innsmouth cycle. And instead of us talking about what somebody else wrote about what you wrote about, I figured, why not go to the source? So can you tell me about it? I never had a chance to read it.
Yeah, it suddenly dawned on me from things I've read about religion and anthropology that Lovecraft had spontaneously recreated an idea of a cult in the technical sense, not just meaning some sort of evil religion, but a particular type of religion that matches very closely a lot of things that are really true about such religions. And I don't think a lot of this work had even been done yet, but he certainly was a wide reader and had some idea of what went on in the world of religion. And it occurred to me that he had come very close. Well, he really had made an authentic sounding religion that conformed first to the pattern of what Anthony Wallace calls revitalization movements, and second, he had done a very compelling sketch of the importance of rites of passage, which Victor Turner, Mircea Eliade, Arnold van Gennep, and others have researched and talked about in all kinds of cultures. And the thing with revitalization movements, which you can find throughout history and all over the world, is that they arise when a traditional culture is challenged by an encroachment, usually of some foreign power or culture, some colonial power, something like that, where they may be persecuting the religion of the indigenous people, or they may simply have conquered them and thus cast doubt on the power of the traditional gods. I mean, all ancient people thought this. If we got our butt kicked by the Assyrians, doesn't that mean the Assyrian gods are more powerful than ours? Maybe we ought to worship them. And so the old way, the old culture and religion are in big trouble. And often you'll have some people that decide, look, we're not going down without a fight. We've got to rescue and preserve the old ways. But in order to do this, they have to revise the old way because they figure, well, obviously the invaders are doing something right because they certainly beat us.
Right.
Can we turn their own guns against them? And so what you have is a kind of a melding of old and new because even though you're mutating the old, this is the only way you can see to save it. And in that introduction, one example I've used because it's not so foreign seeming is what Judah Maccabee and his brethren did when the Seleucid Empire of Antiochus Epiphanes was trying to stamp out Judaism. To a great degree, they didn't even have to persecute, though they did that. But Hellenism sounded real good to a lot of Jews who converted to the worship of Dionysus and went to the gymnasia, as they would have said, where you exercise naked, and this is abhorrent to traditional Judaism, and a lot of things like that. They said, oh, why not? And so Judah and his brethren said, no, we're not going to let Judaism just even disintegrate like this. So they led a revolution for independence, which they attained for about 100-year period. But the resultant Judaism, though monotheistic, was heavily revised in terms of Hellenistic culture. Even the institution of the rabbinate and the way they interpreted Scripture was all derived from the Stoics and so forth. And this is the way it often happens. And sometimes the departures, in order to save the religion, make it so different that the tribal or cultural elders say, look, this is just another heresy, to hell with it, and you have a new religion that starts. Well, now, what does this have to do with Lovecraft? Well, strangely, he has the idea of, when you go over to the Pacific Islands, where you have the deep ones threatening to take over the Kanaka Islanders culture, and then they make further inroads once Obed Marsh contacts them. And I go through all kinds of detail about this, but the Order of Dagon turns out to be a kind of revitalization movement to preserve as much as you can of the New England Christianity while assimilating the religion of the deep ones. And then I go into the initiation thing, and the story is just filled with that. Like Zadok Allen talks about the 3 oaths of Dagon, and so forth, and the element of liminality, and of people undergoing these transitions, hiding themselves away, usually for a short time, but that's why the people that haven't quite finished turning into fish frogs are behind closed doors. And who are they hiding from? And they control the town. Well, it's like a ritual seclusion, and on it goes. And of course, the very writing of the story is supposed to be the great rite of passage of the narrator. And so I try to say this really rings true with the kind of religions he's talking about. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's something I haven't really thought about before. Now, I mean, even Christianity, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it kind of accepted by the Roman Empire when Constantine won a battle?
It looks like, from what I read, that Constantine probably was raised a Christian, but it certainly wasn't. It didn't have official legitimacy, and the battle at the Milvian Bridge kind of enabled him to bring it out in the open and make Christianity a so-called religio licita, a legally licit religion. He didn't make it the state religion, though. That was Theodosius a bit later. But it was syncretism. Well, he was like the Pontifex Maximus of the cult of the invincible Son, as well as being, in his own estimation, the second coming of Christ. But Christianity was the same sort of a thing. It was like compromising with the old religions as it took them over, and it had begun, many think, as a kind of revitalization movement responding to the Roman encroachment on Judaism. So this really pops up all over the place, really.
Wow. Lovecraft was inspired by a couple of other stories as well. Irving Cobb's Fish Heads and Robert Chambers' Harbor Master. I've read. Now, those stories primarily focus on a single person being some kind of hybrid, not a whole culture or society. Is that correct?
Yeah, in Fish Head, it's very obvious because they sort of hint at the fact that the character Fish Head, a local freak and pariah, is half African, half American Indian, and with a general racism of the time, like that'd be enough to make you a freak in their awful estimation.
Right.
In the Harbor Master, there's some sort of a amphibian creature that, of course, must be the tip of the iceberg. It's like the Loch Ness Monster. If there was one, there'd be a whole species of them. And so implicitly there would be some kind of deep one, like species or something in the Harbor Master, though he doesn't really go into that.
Uh-huh. Now, have you heard of a story by Karl Capek? I think it's pronounced, called War of the Newts?
No.
Well, this was pointed out to me by a listener who's named James Kirk. Not sure if that was his real name or what he just posted. But this story is about a merchant sea captain who discovers this race of underwater people, kind of like, fish people. It's more about how they are being exploited by people than in Shadow over Innsmouth, where they are the ones that are doing the exploiting. But there's some interesting parallels, like both feature merchant captains. They both deal with fear of submarine civilizations rising up and overthrowing our own. They both have human cults in the center of the story. In Innsmouth, they're on Devil Reef. In War of the Newts, they are in Devil Bay. But War with the Newts is a satire, and it really seems to point out a lot of racial prejudice and things like that are in the United States. For example, they accuse of some of these newts to have raped women even though they don't physically have the anatomy to do anything like that, and then they are lynched. War with the Newts really seems to focus on how humans can be manipulative and take advantage of other peoples and things like that.
Fascinating. I'd never heard of that. And you're right, neither author could have read the other's work.
Yeah, it didn't come out in English until 1938, and by then Lovecraft was dead, and he didn't speak Czech, so, But anyway, back to Innsmouth. Is there any other points about Innsmouth or things you find particularly interesting?
Well, just a couple of things that interest me slightly, like in Celophaeus, or however the heck you pronounce it, and in the fungi from Yuggoth, there are little intimations that Lovecraft would go on to develop because Celophaeus takes place in a fishing town called Innsmouth, and there is also in the fungi from Yuggoth this one sonnet that where the author he goes up onto a ridge and looks out at the ocean, and he is startled to see sails out of Innsmouth because he thought it was a completely deserted town. And this all somehow figures into the Shadow over Innsmouth. It's because of the latter that I titled the second Innsmouth collection. I did the Tales Out of Innsmouth, a bad pun. But he had that rattling around in his head, I guess. I think it was the name Johannes Lay, the civilization, the city of the deep ones down below Devil's Reef. That seems to be borrowed from Johannes Lahai, some location in Lord Dunsany. So it's funny, you can see him connecting dots, though. And I think the real subtext of the Shadow over Innsmouth is also racist. It's not a satire, sadly.
Yeah, it's sort of mirrors it in a way, because of course, when we talked about this a little on the show, is that some people say the argument is that Lovecraft is maybe being a little less racist because the Robert Olmsted embraces his otherliness. But I think that that's a poor argument, because at no point are the Deep Ones ever exonerated for whatever it is that, all the misdeeds that they've done. They're always made out to be these horrible, horrible things. And I think it's more of a racist warning to, don't interbreed with these people, because if you do, you'll become one of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end, that's why it's a horror story. Oh, my God, he's gone over to their side.
Right.
Because of interracial mixing, as you said, yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because this is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. It's so scary and interesting, and just really touches upon all the really cool stuff of Lovecraft that I really enjoy, but it has that really crappy racist undertone to it.
Yeah, in a case like that, I just view it as, well, I guess it's kind of ridiculous, similar, but it's like Rumpelstiltskin weaving straw into gold. Ultimately, it's the genetic fallacy. Like Heidegger was a Nazi at some point. Does that mean you can't read his philosophy? I mean, it's not a philosophy of Nazism.
No.
I agree with you. I regret it, but Well, in another sense, Lovecraft he was a racist too, but sometimes he was just concerned that cultures not degrade themselves by intermixing.
Yeah.
That if they had their integrity, they were fine. He just didn't like to have the Islanders in good old Yankee Rhode Island. I mean, we don't buy that anymore either, but at least that's a little bit shy of total racism.
Well, Robert, I want to thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time and imparting some of your great wisdom onto us.
Oh, so the favor's done to me. I appreciate it.
We're here with Donovan Loucks, who is an expert in Lovecraft geography and also is the man behind HPPodcraft.com, which we have used so much on the show.
We use it like crazy. We love it.
Basically, you can read all of Lovecraft's works there that are in the public domain, and it's just been such a great resource for us. We're so glad to have you on the show, Donovan. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how did you end up being the guy behind HPPodcraft.com?
Kind of a long history that's kind of lost in the mist of time at this point. Years ago, I got on the alt-horror Cthulhu news group on Usenet via America Online. At the time, we didn't have the prevalence of ISPs like we do today.
Right.
So I got on there, participated in the news group. I took over the fact for the news group from a fellow named Drew Smith, and eventually switched to an actual ISP. I think it was indirect.com, internetdirect.com, and discovered one weekend that I had some space available for making web pages. And so one weekend I learned HTML and started cranking out a Lovecraft page. And it kind of all came together over one weekend because I saw the internet kind of as a giant encyclopedia, and I needed to contribute my chapter to that encyclopedia. And I, had been a Lovecraft aficionado like most of us since high school. Took my books and kind of distilled a bunch of information together and made a website. And then I think it was 1998, somehow I miraculously acquired the domain hplovecraft.com. You know how difficult it is to find a domain name these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that one was available, so I snagged it. The whole thing just started one weekend. I just threw about a dozen pages together that were summaries of printed matter, and it went from there. And now it's, the number of pages now, I think I've got 600 individual pages on the site, and I get over 2,500 unique visitors every day.
Well, I have to say, your goal of contributing to the internet and the collection of knowledge on the internet has been met, because any of these stories that would have been difficult for me to find maybe in a collection somewhere if I didn't have the money to go buy the book, or I couldn't get it from the library. It's been great to be able to pull the stories up, give them a read. It's made us possible to do the show because nobody has to buy anything to listen. If they want to read along and they want to get access to this kind of literature, they can just do it, and that's because of something that you put up there on that one weekend. So that's really great. Thanks so much.
So thank you, sir.
Thank you for thanking me. And just so you know, the texts themselves didn't actually appear on the site till less than 2 years ago. I think it was around Lovecraft's birthday in 2009 that the text went up. Prior to that, they were spread around on a variety of different sites, but the texts are all corrupt. They've been taken from, uncorrected versions and so on. And so S.T. Joshi and David E. Schultz have provided me with these texts, and then I've performed some electronic wizardry to compare multiple versions of the stories in order to get the most accurate version. So the versions that are on the site are actually the most accurate versions available, even in print. But my main goal wasn't so much to provide them so that people could read them, because reading on screen can be difficult, although in this day and age with ebook readers, people are doing that more. But the main benefit is the fact that they can be searched. It's great. I've got a search page where you can just pick the electronic text and search through those, or you can search through the whole site. And of course, when the page for a given story is up, you can just search on that page for the text you're looking for. And I find that tremendously useful.
I've used that on many occasions.
I just imagined that the way you corrected the text was just you did a find and replace. Anytime you saw the word shown, you changed it to shoon, and then we knew.
ST's pretty much done that already. He went to the original text when available at places like the John Hay Library at Brown University, and has corrected them painstakingly by looking at them, looking at the manuscripts. But there's still some, a few errors in there. Humans aren't perfect, and one of the things that I did was I took multiple copies of the text, multiple electronic copies, and effectively did a comparison to show the differences between them, and then manually examined just the differences to correct those to see which ones were right. So I've taken it a step further and done electronic comparisons as well.
That's great.
So cool. The whole reason of having you on the show is we wanted to talk a little bit about Innsmouth. We just covered Innsmouth and finished up last week. Now, you have some knowledge of the actual place that Innsmouth was kind of inspired by.
Yes, some secret and forbidden knowledge.
Please tell us about this.
I love that. That's my favorite kind of knowledge.
Exactly. As Lovecraft mentions repeatedly in his letters, Innsmouth is based on Newburyport, Massachusetts, and we'll have to get into what that means exactly in a minute here because people have misinterpreted that. But my area of expertise in Lovecraftian studies, besides making the Lovecraft Archive, has been geographical in nature, tracking down those points of interest that were significant in Lovecraft's life, or that inspired his stories. And there are many specific real-world locations that do feature in his stories, or that inspired places in his stories. But there's also been a lot of misinterpretation in that regard. People finding real-world locations that weren't really Lovecraft's inspirations. When Lovecraft talks about Newburyport in his letters, and its inspiration on Innsmouth, he says things like Innsmouth reflects a sort of exaggeration of ancient Newburyport, Mass. And he says that term repeatedly, exaggeration. He says another time, he says it's an echo of a Newburyport trip which he took, or it's a considerably twisted version of Newburyport. So Newburyport itself appears at the beginning of the story,
yes,
but then Innsmouth itself is an exaggerated echo or a considerably twisted version of the town. Right. And that's difficult to determine exactly what he means by that. And the conclusion I've come to is that at the time Lovecraft visited Newburyport for the first time, the town was very run down. It had fallen on hard times. It was formerly a very prosperous shipping port, and right near the mouth of the Merrimack River. And it had fallen on hard times, and a number of the buildings were boarded up. The town wasn't dying per se, but it had fallen on hard economic times. And so when Lovecraft says that Innsmouth is a reflection of that, or a exaggeration of it, what he's really saying is that Innsmouth also was a prosperous fishing town at one point, and it had fallen on hard times. But he took it a step further, to the point where there was inbred degeneracy going on, and the commerce had literally fallen off altogether, to the point where the town was abandoned for commercial reasons. And so that, as far as I'm concerned, is the extent to which Innsmouth is based on Newburyport. I don't really believe you can point to a physical building or physical location in Newburyport and say this is what inspired Lovecraft to create this building in Innsmouth.
Now, is Newburyport, did they have hybrid fishmen there when Lovecraft visited?
Let's see. In all the research I've done so far, I have yet to find it. But of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Exactly. Okay. Well, good. So that's still a possibility. All right.
That confirms it for me.
We cannot rule it out.
You had also we'd gone back and forth, and you told me that you had also you'd visited some of the sites of Whisper and Darkness and some of the wilds of Vermont as well, right?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because in one sense, just as Innsmouth isn't really based on physical Newburyport, the places that Lovecraft mentions in Whisper and Darkness were not based on physical locations to some degree either. That's kind of ironic, and he, even though the action in the Whisper and Darkness takes place in Newfane and Townsend, Vermont, Lovecraft never made it to Newfane and Townsend. He talks about quaint, sightly Newfane as if he's seen the village, but the day he wanted to go up there, the buses weren't running, so he never made it up there. So all the area he was familiar with is actually Brattleboro, West Brattleboro, and a little town called Guilford, Vermont, which is immediately adjacent to West Brattleboro. And that's where he stayed with Vrest Orton for a couple of weeks. And so that whole area is what really contributed to the Whisper and Darkness.
I'm interested in what you think about how Lovecraft uses locations as characters, because as you mentioned, Innsmouth isn't necessarily based directly on Newburyport, but it's sort of a perverted or a very strange, surreal version of it. Well,
it's interesting that you put it that way, because he, as far as I'm concerned, he really does use the New England character, the general New England atmosphere to build his stories. So he describes Arkham as being based on Salem, and Innsmouth based on Newburyport, and Kingsport based on Marblehead, and of course Dunwich based on Athol and Wilbraham. So he refers to these towns specifically. And there are instances where there are specific towns or specific buildings in those towns that you could say contributed to his inspiration. And yet, really, it's that overall New England atmosphere. There are books like, in fact, the book that really inspired me to go down this route of investigating Lovecraftian geography was Philip Schreffler's The H.P. Lovecraft Companion. And Schreffler makes a number of errors in his analyses, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of what buildings inspired Lovecraft. And, it's kind of like half the buildings he points to are obvious inspirations because Lovecraft even mentions them by name, and the other half are pure speculation. I think Schreffler's just wrong. And yet I found the book very inspirational, 20 some odd years ago. Right. And so while I also seek out these real world places, and I have lists of them on the website, on the HP Lovecraft Archive, of places you can visit. The key really is just absorbing that New England atmosphere and just exploring the countryside, exploring the quaint towns. And if you walk around a place like Marblehead, Massachusetts, and just wander the streets and the alleys and the graveyards, you will get the same feeling Lovecraft had. And being in those places. The specific buildings are great to visit, and I recommend doing so, but the real key is just soaking up that atmosphere.
So specifically, what brought you down this road? Do you have other geographical interests that you pursue? Do you pursue the intersection between literature and geography as a subject? Or
for some reason, I've always been fascinated by geography and travel, even as a kid. I remember when I was fairly young, becoming interested in architecture as well. I started my interest in architecture in antebellum Southern architecture, but reading Lovecraft's letters has really given me an appreciation for New England architecture of the 17th and 18th centuries. So it's really, a combination of all these things, the architecture and the geography, that's really appealed to me. And ironically, that knowledge of architecture, which, admittedly I'm still very much an amateur at it, has helped me locate some of these points of interest by identifying places Lovecraft refers to only by description in his letters. I've been able to locate them. And so that's also been something that other people have, the area other people have made errors in, is not identifying the right type of architecture and saying, well, this is the building Lovecraft had in mind, even though it's described completely differently.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I can think of 3 examples just off the top of my head. One of the places that people seem to think Innsmouth was inspired by was Gloucester, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And Will Murray wrote an article in Crypt of Cthulhu many years back called I Found Innsmouth. And he mentions 2 places of interest in Gloucester that he believes inspired places in the shadow over Innsmouth. And one of them is the Legion Memorial Building in Gloucester, which is essentially a Masonic hall that was supposedly inspiring the Esoteric Order of Dagon Hall. But the thing is that pillared halls are very common in New England, and pointing to any one of them seems kind of silly. Now, at the same time, Lovecraft did visit Gloucester, was familiar with it. And in fact, one of the buildings he was familiar with in Gloucester was the Sergeant Murray Gilman Hugh House. Mm-hmm. And the reason that house has such a long name is it's just named after 4 previous inhabitants of the building. But clearly one of them is the Gilman name. Uh-huh. Well, the house, though, is really just a simple 2-story tall, 2.5-story gambrel roofed house. And if you look at the Lovecraft's notes for the Shadow over Innsmouth, his discarded draft for the Shadow over Innsmouth, he's got a sketch of the Gilman house, which on that paper he writes its name as Gilham, not Gilman, Gilham House. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that building is drawn as a 5-story tall hotel, not a house, not a 2.5-story gambrel roofed house. Right. And there were hotels in Newburyport at the time that were 4 stories tall, like one of them was the Wolf Tavern, for example, that was 4 stories tall. And so I think this is just a building that was built as such, as a hotel. And there's nothing about the Gilman house in Gloucester to suggest a 5-story tall, brick hotel building. There's I just don't see a connection. One of the comments that Murray makes in his article is he talks about the dormers that the Gilman house in Gloucester has, and trying to compare it to the cupola that the Gilman house in Shadow over Innsmouth has. Well, Lovecraft knew the difference between a cupola and a dormer. A dormer is just a window on a roof line, whereas a cupola is a place at the top of the building where you could look out through windows in every direction. So completely different architectural elements. So there's a couple of examples right there. I can think of one in a classic one is in Philip Schruffler's the H.P. Lovecraft Companion, where Schruffler describes a building in Marblehead called the Pirate's Hideout as inspiring the home of the Terrible Old Man. Problem is, Lovecraft wrote the Terrible Old Man before he visited Marblehead. So there's things like that have gone on where people have just mistaken one type of building for another.
Lovecraft sort of has this reputation of being kind of an agoraphobe guy who just stayed at home and wrote and never talked to anybody and didn't have any friends and just corresponded. But obviously, he traveled a lot.
Yeah, after the death of his mother, he traveled extensively up and down the eastern seaboard. He went as far north as Quebec and as far south as Key West and as far west as Cleveland. And so his travels were pretty extensive. In fact, his description of Quebec is the longest thing he wrote, period, fiction or otherwise. So he was quite the traveler. He really enjoyed this. In fact, one of his favorite things to do, north of Providence, about 8 miles, is a park formerly called Quinsnicket Park, now called Lincoln Woods, named after Abraham Lincoln, and renamed after Abraham Lincoln. And Lovecraft used to walk there to read letters from correspondents, to write back to them, and to write stories. And that was an 8-mile trip one way. And so he would walk up there frequently. There was a ice cream parlor in Warren, Rhode Island called Maxfield's Ice Cream, where he used to walk, and that was about a 12-mile walk down the east side of Narragansett Bay. And he would go there a couple times every summer with friends, or sometimes ride in one of their vehicles. So he was certainly not averse to being outdoors and exploring when his pocketbook could afford it.
Now, there's a rumor that's going on, and I want to know if there's any truth to this, that when he was in Key West, he was there at the same time as Hemingway, that he actually met Hemingway. And the first time that he ever got drunk was with Hemingway, and that they wrestled. I want to know if there's any truth to this rumor that I have just started right now.
Okay, you said that he was in Key West at the same time as Hemingway. That part may be true.
Yes.
Beyond that.
That rumor's been confirmed right now.
Okay.
So yes.
Confirmed.
Yep, by experts. If we were to discover that Arkham and Dunwich and Innsmouth are real places, Donovan, would you go?
I wouldn't go to Dunwich, I'll tell you that right now. Innsmouth I probably wouldn't go to. Kingsport I would consider, as long as I got out before nightfall.
Okay.
It's probably same with Arkham. Arkham seems like the safest place, I would say. Arkham seems like it would be the safest place to go to.
Yeah, it's got a university, for crying out loud. There's got to be enough. It's got to be safe enough that a bunch of people go to school there.
Exactly. I mean, when you think about it, what's the worst stuff that's happened in Arkham? Well, Wilbur Whately died in the library there.
Yeah, if you bring a dog, you're probably fine.
Yeah, exactly. And then you got the whole Asenath Waite and Edward Derby thing going on there. But, it doesn't sound like you're going to run into much on the street.
No.
So, but the other towns, you might run into something that you don't want to encounter.
No, I would definitely never go to Innsmouth.
Right.
Never. I think I would drive through Dunwich during the day. I'd do a little cruise through, and that would be it. Never get out of the car. But I wouldn't even drive through Innsmouth. That it terrifies me. In Kingsport, yeah, that'd be fine.
Innsmouth I would drive through during the day, but Dunwich I wouldn't, because the way Innsmouth is described, it sounds like you could go there during the day. The risk is you're going to get a flat tire, or something's going to go wrong with your car, and you're going to have to stay in Gilman House overnight. That's the risk.
I want to do. You two would be the perfect Lovecraftian protagonist. You're so scared of everything.
Would you go, Fifer?
What? Oh, I'm leave me out of it.
Have you had any interesting discoveries when you've gone to these places? Things that you have found in your travels that you didn't know before?
Oh yeah. In fact, because this has been my area of scholarship, so to speak, I've discovered loads of this stuff. In fact, looking through Lovecraft's letters, so far I've identified about 1,200 points of interest that Lovecraft mentions in his letters or fiction. And I've visited more than half of those. So that's been my goal for the last nearly 20 years now, is tracking all these places down, and I'm working on books. It'll probably be a 2-volume book that is going to chronicle all these. And like I said, it's I think it's really cool to visit these locations, but the key thing is don't just hit these locations and run on. You got to really absorb those places. Those towns. So, like I said, about a little over a month ago, I was on another trip to New England. I plan on moving to Providence when I'll do even more exploration. And I spent quite a bit of time in Newburyport at the public library there, much like the narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth, and discovered a few interesting things. One of which is that when Lovecraft describes Market Square in Newburyport, he's pretty much spot on. There's a lot of things there, and we've known this to some extent, but there's a few specific places of interest that I discovered for the first time. For example, Olmsted, the character in The Shadow over Innsmouth, he talks about inquiring at the shops, the lunchroom, the garages, and the fire station in Newburyport. Well, the lunchroom was probably the ideal lunch, which he mentions later in the story. There was a garage there in the 30s called Bradford's Garage that occupied several storefronts on Market Square. Fire station's still there. It was actually built in 1823 as a market house and ceased becoming a fire station in 1980. It's now the Firehouse Center for the Performing Arts. But also, he mentions in the story the Hammond's Drugstore, in front of which he waits for the bus. And the Ideal Lunch that's directly across the square from it. Well, I found the Ideal Lunch. It was previously located at 5 State Street, and it was there from 1920 to 1947. And I actually went into the shop. It's now a shoe store. And I mentioned to the clerks working in there that it was formerly a diner, and one of the women there said, "Oh, that explains the bathrooms in the basement." And I asked to see them, but for insurance reasons, they wouldn't let me down there. But she described them as quote-unquote diner-like, whatever that meant exactly. So there's that. And then directly across the street from State Street was supposedly in the story Hammond's Drugstore. But actually the drugstore that was there was the Charles W. Perry Pharmacy. So there was a pharmacy located directly there, and buses did stop in front of it. In fact, the Ideal Lunch at one point was a ticket office for the B&M Transportation Company, which operated both, obviously, the buses, the trains, and buses from that area. And they had a ticket office in the Ideal Lunch. I've only found evidence that ticket office was operating as early as 1932, and Lovecraft wrote the story immediately before that. So it's debatable whether the ticket office was there at the time. So those are a couple of things I spotted on my last trip, is the fact that Ideal Lunch really did exist. Before this, we didn't know if it was fictional or not. I've even found an advertisement for it, which is pretty amusing to see. There's also a couple other places in Newburyport that I've known about for a while. In the story, the narrator visits the Newburyport Historical Society. No organization of that name exists, but there is the Historical Society of Old Newburyport, which performs the same function. And it's currently in the Cushing House Museum at 98 High Street. But at the time Lovecraft visited the town, it was in the Pettingill Fowler House, which after the Historical Society moved, the Pettingill Fowler House became an Odd Fellows home, a fraternal organization, and then was abandoned for quite a few years. And a few years ago, 3-4 years, it was purchased and renovated. Now it's a gorgeous building on High Street. So that's actually the building that the narrator visits, is the Pettingill Fowler House at 164 High Street. He also visits, as you may remember, the public library, which was the Nathaniel Tracy House. That's still there. And he stays overnight at the YMCA, which was there, in which Lovecraft did stay himself. And it was immediately next door to the public library. Back in the 80s, it burned down. And the library built an extension onto the Nathaniel Tracy House on the side of the YMCA. And so now when you enter the public library, you have to enter through the new wing that was on the side of the YMCA.
Now, I know that before that fire happened, the village people actually stayed there at that YMCA. That's just a fact. Again, a fact that I made up just this minute, but I'm pretty sure it's true.
I don't think I can confirm that one even in the least.
Okay.
Although they have stayed at a YMCA, so it's hard to say whether they stayed at that one or not. So.
And it was fun. Those are the facts as of present.
That's right.
It was fun.
Well, the other big one, as far as I'm concerned, was I found Joseph Kerwin's house.
What?
Sort of.
Whoa, man.
If you read the Case of Charles Dexter Ward, Lovecraft spells out exactly where Kerwin's house is. He says it's opposite Mr. Appenitus Olney's Tavern off Ye Town Street, which is now North Main Street, first on ye north side of Olney's Court. And Olney's Court has long been assumed to be an extension of Olney Street in Providence. So the problem was everything west of North Main Street was dozed around the 30s to widen North Main Street at that point. Mm-hmm. And I found an old plat map from 1918 that shows a building at that location, which was 6 Olney Street. And I looked through old city directories and found out why Lovecraft picked this building. From 1924 to 1928, the building at 6 Olney Street was occupied by a Mrs. Delilah Townsend. And looking through Lovecraft's letters, it reveals why he picked that building. Delilah Townsend was a black woman who did domestic chores for Lovecraft and his aunts.
Oh.
So it's a weird little Lovecraft in-joke that he included her house. And you may recall that in the story, there's a black couple that lives there.
Yeah.
He checks out the building and takes out, first of all, he starts by cleaning off the overmantel and finding Joseph Curwen's portrait. And then he cuts out the portrait and finds Curwen's books behind it.
Right.
So that's why Lovecraft chose that building. The next trick I've got to find is finding out when the house was built, and maybe even a photograph of it. When they did these demolition projects, they would go through and take pretty extensive photographs of the buildings that they were going to demolish. So my guess is somewhere in the Providence City archives is a photograph of this house. And I've looked through some of the photographs for similar projects, but haven't found a collection for that particular project.
Wow.
So we're revealing this here on the show, is that right?
Yep, exactly.
Woohoo! You heard it here first, folks. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time with you. We only had a limited amount, but the stuff you shared with us is super exciting and really, really cool. And hopefully in the future, we might be able to have you back sometime.
That'd be fantastic. I'm available.
Well, once again, thanks so much for the resources on hplovecraft.com. I know that people who listen to the show go there all the time, and I hope you don't mind if we continue linking out to it.
Not at all.
Great.
HPPodcraft.com.
Well, that's all we've got for this week, folks. Thanks for tuning in. I want to once again thank Robert M. Price and Donovan K. Loucks for taking the time to speak with us. Thanks to Mike Mann for helping us through some technical difficulties this week. We'll be back next time on time with Lovecraft collaboration called The Trap. And we're going out this week with the Fear Boys with Bugs song called The Ballad of Agent HP. Enjoy that, and we'll talk to you next week.
I heard you singing to the waves, breaking through the haze. I thought I knew you better. I heard you thinking fathoms deep, like sonar in your sleep. I thought I knew you better. I will not fight the ocean tonight. Take me to the cliffs, because the stars are right. We'll play like dead and bow out.